Hello again, everyone. Today we turn to one of Percy Bysshe Shelley's most famous poems, Ode to the West Wind, written in 1819. We call this lecture Ode to the West Wind, Revolution, Regeneration, and the Power of Nature. This is a poem that is both deeply personal and profoundly political. Shelley, living in self imposed exile in Italy, had just witnessed the Peterloo Massacre, a brutal crackdown on peaceful protesters demanding political reform in England. At the same time, he was struggling with his own creative exhaustion and personal grief. Against this backdrop, Shelley addresses the West Wind as a force of change, destruction, and renewal. Let me start with the contemporary analogy. Have you ever seen a wildfire? The destruction is total. Forests burned to ash, entire ecosystems wiped out. But what happens next? New growth emerges from the charred earth, often stronger than before. This is exactly how Shelley envisions the West Wind. It destroys, but in doing so, it clears the way for new life. So let's break down how Shelley transforms a simple natural phenomenon into a symbol of both personal and political revolution. First, let's read the poem through. Ode to the West Wind by Percy Bysshe Shelley. 1. O wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being, thou from whose unseen presence the leaves dead are driven like ghosts from an enchanter fleeing. Yellow and black and pale and hectic red, pestilence-stricken multitudes, O thou who chariotest to their dark wintry bed, the winged seeds where they lie cold and low, each like a corpse within its grave, until thine azure sister of the spring shall blow her clarion o'er the dreaming earth, and fill driving sweet buds like flocks to feed in air, with living hues and odors plain and hill. Wild spirit which art moving everywhere, destroyer and preserver, hear, O hear. 2. Thou on whose stream, mid the steep sky's commotion, loose clouds like earth's decaying leaves are shed, shook from the tangled boughs of heaven and ocean, angels of rain and lightning, there are spread on the blue surface of thine airy surge. Like the bright hair uplifted from the head of some fierce Maenad, even from the dim verge of the horizon to the zenith's height, the locks of the approaching storm thou dirge, of the dying year, to which this closing night will be the dome of a vast sepulchre, vaulted with all thy congregated might of vapors from whose solid atmosphere black rain and fire and hail will burst, O hear. 3. Thou who didst waken from his summer dreams the blue Mediterranean where he lay, lulled by the coil of his crystalline streams, beside a pumice isle in Baiae's bay, and saw in sleep old palaces and towers quivering within the waves' intenser day, all overgrown with azure moss and flowers, so sweet the sense faints picturing them. Thou, for whose path the Atlantic's level powers cleave themselves into chasms, while far below the sea blooms in the oozy woods, which wear the sapless foliage of the ocean, know thy voice and suddenly grow gray with fear, and tremble and despoil themselves. O hear. 4. If I were a dead leaf thou mightest bear, if I were a swift cloud to fly with thee, a wave to pant beneath thy power and share the impulse of thy strength, only less free than thou, O uncontrollable. If even I were as in my boyhood, and could be the comrade of thy wanderings over heaven, as then, when to outstrip thy skyey speed scarce seemed a vision, I would ne'er have striven, as thus with thee in prayer in my sore need. O lift me as a wave, a leaf, a cloud, I fall upon the thorns of life, I bleed. A heavy weight of hours has chained and bowed, one too like thee, tameless and swift and proud. 5. Make me thy lyre, even as the forest is. What if my leaves are falling like its own? The tumult of thy mighty harmonies will take from both the deep autumnal tone. Sweet though in sadness, be thou, spirit fierce, my spirit, be thou me, impetuous one. Drive my dead thoughts over the universe, like withered leaves to quicken a new birth. And by the incantation of this verse, scatter as from an unextinguished hearth. Ashes and sparks my words among mankind. Be through my lips to awakened earth the trumpet of a prophecy, O wind. If winter comes, can spring be far behind? So let's break down the poem. In the first 5 lines, right from the start, Shelley's address to the wild west wind suggests that this is not just any wind. It's a wild, untamed, and almost supernatural force. He calls he calls it the breath of autumn's being, immediately linking the wind to the cycle of seasons, death, and change. The dead leaves are compared to ghosts from an enchanter fleeing, reinforcing the eerie supernatural quality of the wind's power. The colors yellow and black and pale and hectic red suggest disease and decay. These are the colors of autumn, of dying leaves, but also of fevered bodies. But let's pause here. What's interesting is that Shelley doesn't just describe death, he describes it in terms of movement. The wind is carrying away the old, making space for the new. This is where we get to Shelley's famous description of the wind as both a destroyer and a preserver. Let's look at lines 6 through 14. The west wind as a charioteer of seeds. Here, Shelley extends the metaphor of the wind beyond death. Now it is also a charioteer of life. The winged seeds, in line 7, lie buried in the earth, waiting for spring. This is a metaphor for potential. Change is coming, but it is currently dormant. The azure sister of the spring, in line 9, represents regeneration. Spring, Shelley's symbol of political renewal, will eventually arrive. And the repetition of "oh here" is a plea. Shelley's not merely describing nature, he is invoking the wind as a divine force. Critic Harold Bloom notes that Shelley's west wind is not just a symbol of nature but a mythic force, one that, quote, expresses the poet's belief in the inevitability of revolutionary change. That's in his Shelley's mythmaking. In other words, Shelley isn't just talking about the weather, he's talking about revolution. Think about how often we see this pattern in history. In the 1960s, the civil rights movement was a storm, destroying old prejudices to make way for a more just society. In the Arab Spring, social movements swept across nations like a wind of change. Shelley's poem taps into this timeless idea: destruction is necessary for progress. Let's take a look at lines 15 to 25, the west wind as a storm bringer. Shelley's imagery here turns apocalyptic. The wind now controls not just the leaves, but the entire sky. The loose clouds, in line 16, are described as Earth's decaying leaves. Just like the fallen leaves, they signal death. The Maenad, reference in line 21, is particularly striking. In Greek mythology, the Maenads were frenzied women who worshipped Dionysus with ecstatic violence. This tells us that the west wind is not just powerful, it's wild, chaotic, and untamable. The wind is now a dirge of the dying year, line 24, turning into a funeral song for the past. Earl Wasserman argues that Ode to the West Wind captures Shelley's philosophy of cyclical history. The old world must die before the new world can be born. This explains why the poem shifts between mourning and hope, destruction and renewal. Again, let's think about modern parallels. After the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, old regimes collapsed, but from the ruins emerged new governments, new freedoms. This is the West Wind in action, sweeping away what was to make room for what will be. Shelley's Ode to the West Wind is a poem that encapsulates several interconnected themes, all revolving around the central metaphor of the West Wind as both a destroyer and a preserver. Let's look at some major themes that shape the poem's meaning. Shelley's repeated emphasis on the West Wind's dual role, its ability to destroy in order to create, forms the backbone of the poem. In part 1, the wind sweeps away dead leaves, which are compared to pestilence-stricken multitudes, emphasizes death and decay. However, in part 2, the wind does not just carry away the old, it also plants winged seeds, ensuring new life will emerge in spring. The cycle of decay leading to rebirth reflects both nature's process and historical revolution. Shelley suggests that destruction is necessary for progress, much like how old political regimes must fall before new, just societies can rise. This is a central romantic idea. Nature is not static, it's always in flux, always in the process of remaking itself. By the time we reach part 5, Shelley's tone shifts from descriptive to deeply personal. The poet here asks the wind not just to stir the world, but to stir him. He says, "Make me thy lyre, even as the forest is." Shelley wants to become the musical instrument played by the wind, so that his words can inspire others just as the west wind, stirs nature. The poet is powerless without the wind. Just as words are powerless without listeners, the repetition of "Oh, here" in lines 14, 28, and 70 throughout the poem reinforces the idea of a plea. Shelley's not commanding the wind, he's begging to be transformed by it. In the final line, "If winter comes, can spring be far behind?" Shelley leaves us with an optimistic paradox. Even in the darkest times, renewal is inevitable. The theme of the poet as a prophet aligns Shelley with other romantic thinkers, especially William Blake, who saw the poet as a visionary capable of seeing beyond the present and shaping the future. Shelley's poem has been analyzed extensively by literary scholars, many of whom focus on its political implications, its philosophy of history, and its deeply personal plea for poetic inspiration. Harold Bloom, in his Shelley's Mythmaking, argues that Ode to the West Wind is a political allegory, representing Shelley's belief in the inevitability of revolutionary change. Bloom emphasizes the storm imagery in part 3, noting that the black rain and fire and hail represents not just natural forces, but social upheaval. Shelley's wind, Bloom argues, is not a passive observer of history, it actively reshapes it. This aligns with Shelley's radical politics, particularly his unwavering support for liberty and his rejection of monarchy. The critic Paul de Man writes in his Rhetoric of Romanticism, he takes a more philosophical approach, arguing that Ode to the West Wind reflects Shelley's desire to dissolve the boundary between himself and nature. Shelley doesn't want to simply describe the wind, he wants to become the wind. That line, "Make me thy lyre," is not just a poetic device, it's a wish for total self-annihilation into something greater. De Man suggests that Shelley is engaged in a romantic paradox. He wants to surrender his identity while also using poetry to influence the world. This interpretation highlights Shelley's romantic idealism, where the self and the universe are deeply interconnected. The critic Earl Wasserman, in his Shelley A Critical Reading, connects the Ode to the West Wind to Shelley's larger philosophy of history. The poem reflects the romantic idea of history as cyclical, rather than linear. The West Wind's destruction is not final, it leads to renewal, just as political revolutions lead to new societies. Wasserman reads the final line, "If winter comes, can spring be far behind?" as an expression of historical inevitability. Change is not optional, it is the fundamental law of the universe. This reading aligns with Shelley's optimism about progress. The critic James Chandler, in his England in 1819, sees Ode to the West Wind as a sublime meditation on nature's overwhelming power. He argues that the West Wind is a romantic sublime object. It's awe-inspiring, vast, and uncontrollable. Chandler connects this to the romantic fear of insignificance, the idea that humans are small, powerless, and subject to forces far beyond their control. However, rather than despair, Shelley embraces this power, seeing it as a source of inspiration rather than fear. So, where do we find Shelley's West Wind in today's world? Look at things like climate change, Shelley's wind, modern hurricanes, wildfires burning up California. They all show that nature is still a force of both destruction and renewal. Social movements like the Arab Spring, Me Too movement, and other political upheavals all reflect the idea that old structures fall and new ideas rise. And then there's the role of the poet. In the age of social media, who are today's quote unquote poet prophets spreading revolutionary ideas across the world? Could Shelley's West Wind now be Twitter, TikTok, or viral activism? Shelley's poem remains deeply relevant because it reminds us that history moves in waves. There's always a storm, but there is always a spring that follows. So I'll leave you with this question. What forces in our world today are acting as a west wind, sweeping away the old to make way for the new.